Again, my name is Jocelyn Molyneux, and I am the founder of Waste Not Farms and the creator of Jocelyn's Soil Booster Regenerative Growing Tools. And so what that looks like is we have a full line of soils, soil amendments, and natural plant foods that we make here on our farm up in Hockley Valley, which is about an hour north of Toronto. And a lot of our products are ultimately powered through worms. So I am a worm farmer, and I have about 2 million red wiggler earthworms working day and night for me in our barn here. And they ultimately transform waste materials like food waste, agricultural waste, and industrial byproducts into natural fertilizers, natural soils, and natural plant foods that you can feel safe and secure using because you know they're chemical free and you know that they've been handmade here at our farm, so they pass the quality test. All right, so I'm going to share my slides here, and we're going to jump right in. And we only have an hour, so I do want to keep us moving. And I want to confirm that everyone can see the slides right now. Everyone can see the slides. Is that confirmed? Okay, so not everyone is seeing the slides. So let me just get this sorted out, and we will get down to business. So I do need to share my screen, which is always a bit of a trick. And so for you non-millennials, you can feel good that you're not the only one that struggles with the tech issues sometimes. All right, so this should do the trick. We should be pulling up the slides right now, and we should be ready to go. All right, so this first session is going to specifically be about sizing up your growing space for maximum growth. So the goal for today is to equip you with a little bit of knowledge, some new resources, and ultimately some questions that you can take back to your home, to your growing space, to help assess what are some of the assets that you already have, where may there be room for improvements, ultimately where may you want to invest in some improvements, and really how are you going to maximize what you already have going for you. So we are going to start with a quick round of intros, and this is a bit of a test. I have to admit, I've never actually done this in a webinar before, so we'll see how it goes. It is not mandatory. However, what I was hoping would be, if you would like to introduce yourself, I'd love for you to put up your hand. And what I would like you to do is, in 30 seconds or less, give me your name, the number of seasons that you have been growing, or let's say the number of years, and also what is your top goal for your growing efforts this year. Is it something you want to learn? Is it something new you'd like to try and grow? Is it a particular pest that you want to overcome? I would love to hear what you're hoping to achieve. So in order to put your hand up, it does require having your Zoom open. And to put your hand up, you would want to, let's find the tab. So down at the bottom, there is a tab or a label called Reactions. It is located on the bottom of your screen to the right-hand side. And if you click on that, you'll be able to see that there is, in fact, you can put your hand up. There's an option to put your hand up as an emoji. And so we'll just very quickly, we'll take 2 or 3 minutes here for anybody that would like to open and introduce themselves. We'll give you the option to do that right now. All right, thank you, Annette. We have a first volunteer. Thank you so much, Annette. And so Annette, you can unmute your mic.
Mhm.
And Annette, given that you are you there? Can you
I
say hello?
am. I am.
Awesome. Thank you, Annette. And as our first willing participant, I'd like you to know that you have won our giveaway bag for today. So thank
Yay.
for your um, for your active participation. You'll be winning a 700-gram bag of our worm manure product.
Oh, nice.
If you could please direct message through the chat
Hmm.
the other Jocelyn Molyneux,
Okay.
the co-host, which is in fact my colleague Kat, who is sitting here with me helping to facilitate behind the scenes. And then Annette, if you want to introduce yourself in 30 seconds or less.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, my name's Annette Richards, and I am a member farmer of Homestead, Toronto, at Don's View Park in nearby Fresh City. I've been farming for 5+ years now, and my main goal for the next season coming up is I want to try a CSA type situation on a small scale, kind of like with friends and family, to see how it goes.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you so much, Annette. So sounds like you'll be able to put the worm manure to good use. I'm sure you'll be getting your seedlings started pretty soon.
Yes.
And I love what you're doing, Downsview Fresh City. They're a great place to build a farming career and working towards developing a CSA. For those of you who don't know what that means, it's a community supported agriculture program whereby people would buy a share in Annette's growing efforts, and then they would receive the bounty from those efforts through the season. So I'm sure we'll have an opportunity down the road to share some of those opportunities. Anybody else wanting to introduce themselves? Okay, I have two more participants. I'm just going to start at the top of my list here. We'll go first with Wally and then with Jane B. So Wally, if you could unmute your mic, please,
Yeah,
and go ahead.
yeah. Hi, everybody. I'm just a backyard gardener. I have a small, few raised beds in the backyard. I'm just trying to learn more about how to be a little more productive with my gardening. And one of the problems I've had that I hope we can discuss is I've put mosquito nets over top of my cabbage and some of my other cabbage and broccoli plants, and I've had these little white moths flying around, and they're still somehow getting through those mosquito nets and destroying my crops. So that's one of the things I hope we can address during these meetings, among many other things. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Wally. Well, yes, cabbage flies are a big problem for most brassica plants. Cabbage, of course, being a type of brassica, along with broccoli and Brussels sprouts and a kohlrabi, a whole bunch of them. And netting can work, however, doesn't always work. So I'm going to flag that as something to discuss in terms of pest control. Thanks, Wally. So Jane, you can go.
Yes, I help my mom in her garden, and we have a lot of crab grass, creeping Charlie, creeping strawberries, drought. The grass dies in gaps, and we tried fertilizing it and reseeding and everything, and it's a mess. It's green though, which is good, but it's a mess.
Right, so you're getting a lot of those invasives in
Yeah.
there that are hard to control, and this is a really common problem across the board, whether you're urban, suburban, or rural. We have so many invasive plants now in our ecosystem, and they really have an advantage over a lot of the natives. So that is a great topic. Probably an entire session could be done on that one, Jane. So we'll add that to the list. Thank you.
Okay.
Next on my sheet here, I have Suzanne. Suzanne, would you like to introduce yourself in 30 seconds or less?
Sure, I just unmuted myself. Hi, I'm Suzanne, and I don't really know very much about growing vegetables, but I live downtown Toronto, and there is a little bit of soil that I can have access to because I live in a co-op, And I've been on the gardening committee, but we mostly grow pollinator-friendly plants. But I would like to learn more about vegetables growing. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, more about veggies. And I love that you're coming from a co-op and a community garden. There's so
Mhm.
much potential for those spaces and community and working with your neighbors. And it's great you got some pollinators, but sounds like we need to diversify. That's the core component of regenerative growing is diversity. So the more different types of plants that you have, the better. The
Mhm.
healthier the plants are going to be, the healthier the soil. It really all works together. So thank you, Suzanne, and welcome. Do we have, I don't see any more hands up. Do we have, I don't think we have any, so let's keep moving. Awesome. So as I mentioned, we are going to spend a few minutes. Oh, that's not what I want. Um, discussing some key factors to look at. And then there will be lots of time for Q&A as well. So I want to make sure if you have questions as I'm presenting over the next few minutes, please put those in the chat. And we do, in fact, have Kat, who is monitoring the chat. She's going to be organizing those questions, and we will try to get through them as or as many as we can in the last Q&A section of this webinar. So on that note, we're going to get right into it. So the first real piece that you want to assess, whether you're growing indoors, outdoors, on a balcony, in a backyard, is your light. And that's because at the end of the day, light is ultimately what is fueling growth. And I would imagine that many of us are at least have a passing familiarity with the fact that plants are the original solar power. So you can kind of think of a plant, whether it's a tiny little seedling that's just popped out of the ground, or a big, beautiful, sequoia that's been there for hundreds of years. Every little cell covering the outside of that plant is essentially a solar cell. So just like we now have solar panels on our houses, plants have always been covered in solar plant panels. And that's because it's solar energy that derives their ability to pull carbon dioxide and water out of the air, pull carbon dioxide out of the air and pull apart the carbon and oxygen molecules to create oxygen and carbohydrates. So carbohydrates is a fancy word for sugar. And ultimately, what solar power allows your plants to do is generate their own sugar. So unlike you and I, we have to consume sugar to fuel our metabolic activities. Plants have a pretty darn awesome mechanism by which they are able to do that themselves, so long as they have a few key pieces. And of course, light is a big one. Carbon dioxide, which there's certainly no shortage of these days in the atmosphere, and moisture being the third one. So that's ultimately what allows the plant to create carbohydrates and fuel its own growth. Now, for those of you who are relatively new to regenerative growing, or this idea of staying off the chemical fertilizers and following Mother Nature's principles instead, what's important to know is that plants depend on the microbes, the things like bacteria, fungi, amoeba. Plants depend on these microbes that are in the soil and, in fact, in the air and all over them as well, to access the nutrition they need. And we'll certainly go deeper into this at a future session. It's something that I'm happy to speak to, and it is really a topic you need a lot of time to be able to understand. But the short and long of it is that microbes are like the pizza delivery guy of the soil. And so what happens is the plant will call up the pizza delivery microbe and put in an order for the pizza, the type of pizza that it needs. So in fact, the plant is well aware of what nutrients it's missing or what nutrients it needs for its next stage of growth, or perhaps what nutrients it needs to protect itself from an incoming pathogen. But to access this nutrition, the plant, in fact, has to place an order with the pizza delivery guy, who then has to go out in the soil further than the plant's roots would ever reach themselves, and it has to make the pizza. How it does this is ultimately through the use of enzymes. It's able to dissolve inorganic minerals like sand and clay and pull apart the individual molecules or nutrients that are required. So in this case, if the plant needed more calcium, the microbe, a particular type of microbe, as long as it's ready and waiting to pick up the pizza hotline, it will in fact go find a sand molecule that has a piece of calcium locked within it. It'll excrete a liquid, an enzyme that dissolves that mineral and allows that microbe to ingest the calcium, which after a few stages that I'm not going to dive into right now, that calcium is going to be excreted for the plant at the plant's root system, by which the plant will then absorb that calcium and use it in its functioning or in its building, whatever it needs that calcium for. In exchange, that microbe, that pizza delivery guy, he's getting a tip. Really, like he's getting a monetary or a resource exchange for delivering that nutrient to the plant. And that resource, so we could think of it as like a monetary tip, an extra, $5, is in fact a carbohydrate or a sugar molecule. So to bring us back to where we started, the reason that plants so dependent on lights and why it really is crucial to successful growing is that not only do they need it to create food for themselves, but they also need it to create the food or the nutrients that they require from the soil that they work with the microbiology to access. So with that really brief overview under our belt, I want to lay out a few considerations for you to, perhaps you want to jot them down. And what I would really like you to do, if you're able, is work on these over the next week, and that way you can bring them back to our meeting next week, and any questions or anything that was unclear or further development that you would like, we can address at that point. So the first thing to consider with light is really the angle and the direction. So we do know that, of course, the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. Generally, south-facing windows or light is considered the best light. It is the maximum exposure that you can have for light. So for our indoor growers, we want to be looking at which direction our windows are facing and assessing if there are barriers that may block or create shade at different times of the day or potentially at different times of the year. Same goes for outdoor growing. We want to assess where is the sun coming from and what parts of the day are going to receive that sun. Handy tip here is that it is important to remember that deciduous plants, maple trees and perennial bushes, through the growing season are going to create more and more shade in your growing space. So whether it's a big tree out your window or some bushes in your garden, you need to anticipate not only the shade they're creating now, but of course the shade they're going to create once they're full of foliage. Further to this is this idea of how much sun you're getting. And one way to check this is to set a reminder on your phone for early in the morning, midday, and then mid-afternoon, and really just take a look, stand where your plant would stand, and try to assess how much sun how much is being blocked. And certainly you can even, there are more in-depth ways to chart the path of the sun. And that's another important tip to take into consideration, because we don't always think about this in our hurried, busy lives, but through the year, from between the two solstice events, so we have our winter solstice, December 21st, and our summer solstice, June 21st. And these are the maximum distances at which the sun has its angle. So it is important to appreciate. It's a little bit not necessarily intuitive, especially if you're a new grower, that the sun actually shifts slightly towards the north as we move into our summer season, which then maximizes in the middle of June. After the middle of June, the sun is then shifting ultimately about 10 or 15 angles back to the south. And then by the middle of December, it's at its maximum southerly position. So that is important to really conceptualize as you're planning your growing spaces. All right, so the next piece to really assess is this idea of microclimates. And again, this comes back to an idea that's very closely tied to permaculture. And what that is that within any space, so whether it's our home or our garden or even a small balcony area, there are different microclimates that exist. And a microclimate can be broken down into sort of three potential variables. So the first variable would be humidity level, or the amount of moisture that is existing within the air. And humidity is very important, again, because plants and microbes, in fact, depend on water for healthy growth. Different plants will have different humidity requirements, so you want to get a feel for where certain areas might be more humid than others. An indoor example would be any place that there is running water, there's likelihood to be higher humidity levels. So, of course, in your bathroom would be an obvious example. Outdoors, it's a little bit harder to conceptualize, but in fact, it does work the same way. And an example would be if there is a part of your balcony or your property where water accumulates, or standing water sits longer, because around any standing water, there's ultimately going to be higher humidity levels. Humidity is also greatly influenced by wind. And so one way indoors, if you have too much humidity, would be to get a fan. Outdoors, what we want, we don't have as much control in terms of being able to increase or decrease the wind, but you want to take that into consideration, because wind ultimately increases evapotranspiration, which is the speed at which water is evaporating, so going from a liquid state to a gaseous state. And ultimately, this is important to appreciate for, as I said, a number of reasons. A really big example to understand this is we have a lot of growers we work with who are in high-rise buildings, and they're growing on balconies. This is a challenging environment. Same with a green roof, for example. These are challenging environments, not least because there can be a lot of wind at that height. And so the soil is going to dry out incredibly quickly, much more quickly than if you were at ground levels or someplace where perhaps you had more shade. Shade, of course, the sun directly influencing humidity levels as well. Microclimates should also be evaluated in terms of whether they can bring additional heat or cool, yes, that is a real word, to your growing area. And so again, indoors, we would want to be looking for things like, where are there heat vents? Or alternatively, where are there windows that perhaps sometimes have to be cracked open because in fact, it is too hot in your growing space.
Mm.
Even a window that is ultimately closed may be quite drafty. So drafty windows need to be assessed as well. We have some new folks joining. So just a quick reminder, everyone should have their mics muted at this point, but there will be an opportunity later to turn them back on. Outdoors, what's interesting is that any kind of solid material is in fact going to hold heat and release that heat as it gets cooler, whether it's the sun has gone down or the temperature is simply dropping. So for example, if you have access to an outdoor patio, those patio stones will in fact hold the heat in their physical structure and then radiate that heat to whatever is sitting on top of them as the outdoor temperature changes. So this is a really effective way to, for example, if you have heat-loving plants like tomatoes, which do really well in containers, but love hot, sunny, dry conditions, they are going to do really well if you can position those containers on some patio stones or perhaps by a south-facing brick wall that again is going to take in that heat and then radiate it out as the temperature gradient changes. Cool is of course the opposite. So where are there places that that cool drafts might be coming from? Outdoors, often we want to know where the predominant winds are coming from. Generally, we have northerly winds here in Canada, but based on your location, based on obstructions or buildings, wind tunnels, that really may be influenced by your particular scenario. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And certainly things like raised garden beds, raised containers generally warm up faster than in-ground growing. And again, just like any standing water, anywhere that the snow is going to be last to disappear is ultimately going to radiate additional cool temperatures in that particular location. So this is really what microclimates are all about, is appreciating that your growing space, however small it is, in fact, is not homogenized and likely has slightly different variables or fluctuations at work. All right, so the third variable that we're going to talk about today in terms of assessing the growing space that you have and figuring out how you're going to maximize that is this idea of three-dimensionality, 2 and 3 dimensionality. And really what a great example of this in permaculture, in regenerative growing, there's a concept known as a food forest. And what this is really getting to the heart of is that in a natural ecosystem, there is no energy, no resources going to waste, because the different plants that are working together, that are growing side by side, and in fact below and above and around each other, are each filling a niche space, a niche three-dimensional space that allows little resources to go to waste. So for us, what we want to think about is not just of our growing space as a level plane, but in fact, we want to think of it as a 2D and in fact 3D, so a cube shaped space. And that within that space, there is going to be certain plants that will prefer the microclimates, including the light accessibility available in the lowest, let's say, third of that cube. There'll be certain plants that are optimized to grow in the middle third of that cube, and there'll be plants that are ideal for growing in the top third of that cube. And what those are and how they work together, there's no strict rules, you know. Mother Nature's very flexible. She likes to be creative, but it certainly all goes back to this idea of first assessing what space do I have and what variables like light or warmth or coolth or humidity, what are those variables going to be like at these different spaces? So when you're indoors, you'd want to assess your windows from where they're close to the bottom, in the middle, and then of course at the top, if you're lucky enough to have any skylights, or potentially you have a corner with two windows that are facing different directions. Those are going to give you a lot of unique options that you can really truly maximize. Outdoors, it's a similar concept, and this idea that certain plants, low-lying plants, will be like ground covers, so they're going to stay low and they're going to spread out horizontally. Some plants, often a lot of shrubby perennial plants, do like that mid-layer level. And that's really allows them, as perennials, they're there all year round. But of course, they're growing a majority of their foliage during the growing season, and that there are plants that really like to grow tall and high and are happiest when they're unobstructed at the very top, and that a lot of plants, in fact, will reach for that light, and will continue to grow up and up and up. So certainly you wouldn't want to plant one of those as your low laying ground cover option, because you're going to be fighting the natural instincts of that plant. Again, when we're talking about inside growing, it's this concept that plants also grow in 3D. They're not linear, and they will move into the space that they prefer. So we often see a vine type plant that is grown on a top shelf and then is spilling over down over the side of a bookcase, for example. And the opposite would be true as well, that you could have a vine that's growing from the bottom and then trellised, or using a support to grow vertically rather than perhaps its natural tendency, which might be horizontal. So really what's nice about this is that once you understand your space, once you understand the natural tendencies of the plants that you're hoping to grow, you're able to mix and match the partnerships, so that ultimately, not only are they working together underground in the soil, and I can assure you they definitely are, and they do that in large part thanks to the microbiology that they're sharing amongst one another, but they will in fact interact with each other outside of the soil in how they maximize the available resources and growing space. All right, so I quickly just want to run through some mistakes to avoid, and I'll be the first to admit that these are drawn from my own experience. And so, you know, if I can save you a little bit of frustration, then this would be where I would start. So we are going to be talking about seed starting in future sessions. However, if that is something that's on your radar and you may be looking to get going sooner rather than later for some of those long gestation plants, keep in mind that you may have plenty of space to start your seeds, but that those seedlings will in fact need to be potted up. They will need more space as they grow, and ultimately before they are able to move out to their forever home. And it's, you know, it's one of the oldest new grower mistakes in the book, is to be overly ambitious with your seed starting. You know, they're so small and you think, you know, what are the chances they all come up, and then they all come up and you got 100 tomatoes, and you know, first they're taking up this room and then they're taking up that much room, and then you got 5 shelves that you're trying to manage them all, and then you don't have enough light. And then that's really where your challenges start, because if your seedlings aren't getting enough light, they're not growing on track, they're going to get leggy, they're going to be reaching, and then, you know, it's basically just downhill from there. So you know, start small, especially with seed starting, and really forecast how much space you're going to need, and do you have enough light to accommodate that. As I've mentioned already, this idea of shade, and that shade increases through the growing season, and it also moves through the growing season as a result of how the sun's angle is changing within the sky. So really important to have a handle on that, as there's no sure way to fail than to plant a sun-loving plant in a place that ends up being overcome by a deciduous tree. Overcrowding is, again, another way that you can easily sort of go down the wrong path. And ultimately, that often happens when we're not thinking in 3 dimensions, when we're really thinking in a single plane. And all our plants are sort of forced to fight for resources within that single plane. So again, one way to regenerative growing, permaculture, Mother Nature, she loves a lot of plants in a tiny space. In fact, you know, weeds are Mother Nature's answer to bare soil. If it were up to her, there would never be any bare soil. However, you really need to do that following her best practices. Last but not least is this idea of moisture. And I've touched on it a few times. Hopefully I've hit home the fact that all these different variables interact with one another and influence the rate at which moisture is going to disappear from your plant and from your soil. And this is really a problem, because not only the plant depends on it, but all the microbiology that's driving the success of your efforts, they have to live in water. As soon as your soil gets too dry, those microbes are forced to go dormant or just die. And that's why one of the best but easiest tips is just have a regular watering schedule, and you're going to keep those microbes floating in that nice film of water that exists in moist soil. Okay, so I quickly want to touch on some potential problems that you may start to foresee given your growing space, and what could be some solutions. So low humidity, as I mentioned, for example, if you're on a balcony where there's a lot of wind, or perhaps you have a really sunny location that's constantly beaten with sun, and evapotranspiration is happening very quickly, you want to increase the water holding capacity of your soil. So one recommendation would be to use our biochar product, which increases the ability for soil to hold moisture. It has a lot of tiny, tiny, tiny little pore spaces that holds water when there's lots of water available, and then it releases that water back to the soil when it's needed. So this is a great solution if you're watering your plants and it's all running through the bottom. You can in fact layer biochar at the bottom of your container, and instead of that runoff going to waste, the biochar will absorb it and then release it back up to the plant as needed. The same would go for a mulch. So a mulch is really pivotal, protecting the soil, whether it's with living plants, and if not with, then it's with a mulch like a wood chip or dried leaves. This will create a barrier that helps to prevent the loss of moisture. High humidity isn't quite as much of a problem. It's a bit of an easier one to solve. Ultimately, maybe you just need to open a window or buy a small fan. And lots of people would be jealous, because what it means is that you can, in fact, grow tropical plants that love a high humidity environment. If it's too cold, if you have drafty windows or you're concerned about a temperature for your heat lovers, there's easy fixes for building your own greenhouse, whether it's over your seedlings to get them started. Take advantage of the greenhouse effect in a window, or lots of people use heating mats that you can put underneath plants to allow the heat to radiate up into that plant that's really desperately for it. If you have an environment that's too warm, as I mentioned, if you have sun beating down nonstop from daybreak to day end, it's going to be hot, and ultimately that's going to affect your moisture level. So certainly you would want to focus on growing heat lovers. You wouldn't want to be growing plants that need the cooler weather, and that is really something we can talk about more down the road. But it is important to appreciate that both worm manure and biochar are great options for helping that soil to hold moisture. Low light, that's an easy fix. You are going to want to order some grow lights. Too much light, similar to too much warmth. Ultimately, you want to be using products, using Mother Nature's tools to reduce evapotranspiration. Lots and lots of solutions if you feel like you're low on physical space. Hopefully this idea of thinking in 3D is giving you some cool ideas. And I have to point out that our products are super concentrated, so you don't need to buy the big bags of horse poop from Home Depot. All our products are really handy and are great for small spaces and pack a powerful punch. Too much space, well, frankly, that's not a problem at all. So the last thing to really loop in before we go to the Q&A is this idea that plants are actually really good at solving these problems themselves. And in nature, they don't have someone there to baby them or to water them when there's been a few days without rain, or move them through the season as the light changes. Plants are in fact very independent, or as I have come up with, I'm going to call it indeplantant. And that's because they can adjust to challenging situations so long as they have the microbial partners available to them that they need to access the nutrients to grow healthy. So a perfect example of this, we all hopefully have had an opportunity to see a sunflower, and it's just incredible. If you see that sunflower, it's really, that head of that sunflower is facing east in the morning, and every hour you can look, you almost practically see it moving bit by bit as it follows the sun through the day. And that's a very excessive example, but in fact, almost all plants will move themselves, their leaves. They have the ability to reorient themselves towards maximum sunlight. They have the ability to store moisture within their cells when they need it. But they're only able to do this if they're working within an ecosystem, because as I mentioned before, they need to be able to call up the pizza delivery guy and say, hey, you know what? I really need some more potassium. I can feel the sun is shifting direction, and potassium is one of the things that allows me to chart the path of the sun with my leaves. And the microbes, as long as they're there, this whole process takes about 3 seconds for the plant to ask what for it needs and for the microbes to respond. However, not every microbe can respond to every request. In fact, microbes are very niche oriented. They're very specific, and they have usually only a few roles that they can play. So what that means, you don't need lots of different types of microbes lots of the time or all of the time. What you do need is a wide diversity or a full spectrum of different microbes. A few individual organisms of each variety is enough, because what will happen is the plant, if it needs and when it needs the help from a particular niche microbe, it will put out that chemical signal, a chemical carbohydrate molecule that specifically feeds the niche organism that it requires, that it's dependent on. So that microbial community will get that food, it'll start to multiply, reproduce, and all of a sudden, the 2 or 3 organisms that were lying dormant, ready and waiting for their call to action, are then numbering in thousands and can deliver whatever that plant is ready and waiting for. So don't underestimate the ability for plants to adapt and be resourceful so long as the soil is full of diverse microbiology. Okay, so we are here at the Q&A, and I have a feeling that we have a number of questions that that we can address. We don't have that much time, so I think what I'll quickly do, actually, you know what I'm going to do, if you just forgive me here. I think I'm going to quickly wrap it up, and for those of you, I know some of you are on your lunch break, you got to run, and some of these questions may be more individualized. So just a quick note here on some things to mention. Please do work on your homework, assess your growing space, and come back next week and we can talk about the work you've done and any challenges you're anticipating. I would highly recommend that you sign up for our newsletter, and that can be found at soilbooster.ca. We send that newsletter going into peak season right now is about once a week on Saturdays, and that's just a quick hit on some important educational topics, any events or opportunities to further your learning, potentially some coupons or value opportunities. And for those of you on Instagram, make sure you're following us at Soil Booster is our handle. As a thank you for coming today to our first Jocelyn's Growing group. I am offering you the opportunity for 50% savings, so you can save 15% today only on any and all products that you order at soilbooster.ca. So this is normally, you know, we do a welcome discount of 10%, but I really wanted to show my appreciation. So we're doing the 15, but that's only until 11:59 tonight. So it does expire at midnight tonight. So if you're keen, take advantage of it this afternoon. If you have questions between now and then, shoot me an email. You'll see that at the bottom. But you're going to want to use the code size up, the discount code on the checkout page, size up, to access that 15% savings. Please don't share that discount code with others. It's really strictly as a thank you to you. And next week, we're going to be going a little bit more in depth into this idea of microclimates. We're going to be talking about which plants are best suited, or what types of plants are best suited for the different layers in your growing space. And again, this idea of where are the opportunities to follow Mother Nature's lead and get the best return on our growing investment. So for those that have to jet, thank you so much. We hope you see you next week. And for those of you that have questions, I'm going to just go through them through the chat. So let's see here. Okay, so we have, oh, Ziad's put a cool tool into the chat. Thank you so much, Ziad. We've captured that, Kat. Yeah. You want to download that, please. And so the question here is, are there any good ways to know how much worm compost to add to soil? This is a really excellent question. Thank you for asking it. And one thing to appreciate here is that worm compost or worm manure, this product that Lucky Annette's going to get, is unfortunately, excuse me, that was my phone ringing, is really powerful, but it is unlike a traditional compost. So traditionally with compost, you kind of have this thought that the more the merrier. You need a lot of it. That's why they sell it in these big bags. This is a different type of product because it's about quality, not quantity. And it goes back to this idea that what worm manure is doing is it's bringing the life back to your soil. It's reintroducing the necessary microbiology to your soil ecosystems to make up for whatever losses have occurred in diversity in the past. So unfortunately, there's lots of ways to hurt the microbiome, you may know that word, in the soil. So the level of microbiology, the diversity in the soil. Probably the easiest ways is to use chemical fertilizers because they are toxic to all biology, of course, including ourselves. But there are other ways as well. So for example, excessive digging or tilling. It used to be believed that you want to aerate your soil as much as possible. Now we know, in fact, that that is not the case, and that healthy aerated soil is, in fact, only created through healthy microbiology. They're the ones that build the structure, the porosity. And every time we actually dig in the soil, we're doing more damage than good. So to get back to your question of how much, it's not about adding a lot of the worm manure. It's about adding small amounts and adding them consistently through the season so that whatever is missing at that particular time can be replenished. And so to appreciate this, plants, in fact, have different microbial partners that they want to work with at different stages of their own growth, based on different elements or external factors that are occurring. And as well, we know that the biology is going to help them respond to problems. So if there's a pathogen, if there's some first aid required, the plant's going to ask the microbes to perform that service. So when you add the worm manure, what you're adding is, even in just one handful, there's millions of different types of microbes, a full spectrum. So this product is good for any type of plant because it has the full spectrum of microbiology, and the plant will pick and choose the partners it needs to work with. Now, there are some general rules of thumb. Often we, one suggestion out there is if you're making a potting soil, that you're going to want to use about 10 to 30% worm manure. Again, I think the 10% is certainly sufficient. And certainly there are other application rates that you can find on the soilbooster.ca website that would help for your particular situation. So hopefully that gives you a bit of info. And so I understand there's one more question, but I'm not seeing it on. Okay, so someone's raised their hand. Barbara, I believe, raised their hand. So why don't you unmute yourself? And you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for doing this today. I have a question about crop rotation or soil amendments. So I've had an indeterminate tomato variety in the same spot next to a brick wall, southwest facing. It's super hot, sunny, dry. They love it. Great harvests. And I haven't had any pest issues. So do you recommend kind of rotating vegetable crops in small urban areas or just amending the soil and interplanting?
Yeah, so really it's a 50-50, and it comes down to what is going to work best for your situation. Both options are good and considered best practices. Certainly from a regenerative perspective, often the initial go-to response would be, yes, you want to be moving your crops year to year. You don't want to be planting the same type of plant in the same location year after year after year, because it will deplete the soil, in particular nutrients, and it may encourage pest problems to develop over the years. So what's interesting is Wally mentioned earlier about his cabbage moths. And one thing that I was thinking was that if you are, Wally, growing your cabbage in the same spot year over year, or even brassicas in the same spot, that some of those cocoons of the cabbage flies may be embedded within the soil. So even though you've protected your plants from new ones entering into your crop, if they're already existing there from previous years, they're going to just come out of the soil and cause you some grief. So for that reason, it is generally recommended you're going to rotate your crops. However, the reality is, that's just not possible for most urban growers. There just isn't that much space. And B, in nature, Mother Nature is not rotating her crops every year. You know, she doesn't have a 3-year crop rotation schedule that she's working on. And that's because diversity is the solution, or the flip side to crop rotation. And because diversity, so having different plants interplanted among your tomatoes, for example, will ensure that the soil is never getting depleted of any particular nutrients. Calcium, for example, really important to our tomatoes. And then this idea of diversity of input. So you spoke to that already a little bit, Barbara. So in your case, it sounds like that's a great spot for your tomatoes. You're having good success. You got to have that warm wall there to keep them hot. And so yes, you're going to want to look at boosting the diversity of inputs into your soil. So interplanting with cover crops would be one way, and that's one of our upcoming topics. And then diversity of what amendments you're using. So worm manure is certainly something I would definitely be recommending. And in addition to that, you want to provide a diverse set of building blocks. So by that, what I mean is that if you're going to always have tomatoes in the same place, try to alternate what type of mulch you're using on your soil. So instead of always using wood chips, for example, year after year after year, what you could do is one year use wood chips, the next year you could use cardboard, the next year you could use dried leaves. And what that's going to do is it's going to supplement the diversity in the soil, so that all those little niche microorganisms that may have slightly different diets or regimes that they prefer are always going to have the building blocks ready and waiting, so that they can swing into action when so requested. So you're right. It definitely comes down to diversity of inputs. And in your situation, what I always try to remind folks is that your worm manure is your biology, and things like mulch or a traditional horse or sheep compost, those are your building blocks. Those are your carbon building blocks. So you really want to be using both for maximum success. So on that note, I'm going to wrap things up. We're a few minutes over, but hopefully you've appreciated the few points I was able to cover today. And on that note, I want to say thank you again. Don't forget to use your 15% off discount code. Size up, one word, gets you that access. And we'll see you next week, folks. Thanks for joining us.